Okay, I think I will start. Yeah, warm welcome to the SAFE workshop EMU at Crossroads, Economic Governance in the European Union, which is hosted at SAFE. SAFE meaning Sustainable Architecture for Finance in Europe. And this is a Leibniz Institute for Financial Research. So the workshop has been organized by a group of social scientists. Most of them are here today, and you will see them either as chairs or presenters throughout the workshop. So our lead is Andreas, and then we have Christian, Claudius, Daniel, Matthias, and Vincent, who will present in a minute. And I think we are really happy that we've been able to put together 2 half days. It's usually quite tiresome on Zoom, so we thought 2 half days is probably better than a full day, with really outstanding papers applying different research angles, different methodological and theoretical angles, and all of you conducting excellent research around the workshop theme. So we have, as you know, 3 panels on Capital Markets Union, on European Banking Union, and on economic governance. Tomorrow at 11, please join us. We have a debate on EU crisis responses. And today at 4, also to be put down into diary, we have a keynote lecture on next generation EU. So we are covering very topical issues, but also ask about the longer term implications of what is going on and has been going on since the previous crisis. The session that you're attending now is about our research group really presenting ourselves, presenting our research agenda. And I'm extremely happy that Adrienne Héritier has agreed to join us for this session and to provide some comments and reflections on our work. So for those of you, a few of you who don't know Adrienne, Adrienne is a political scientist. She held a joint chair with the Social and Political Science Department at the European University Institute. This is also where I myself had the pleasure to work with her in a research project. She was furthermore director of the Max Planck Project Group for Common Goods, Law, Politics and Economics in Bonn, and many other affiliations that I cannot enumerate here. She was also awarded, that is of course worth mentioning, the Leibniz Prize. And Adrienne's research has a focus on policy making, comparative public policy, European decision-making processes, theories of institutional change, deregulation and re-regulation, and new modes of governance. So in short, I think she's ideally situated to discuss our project, and we are very much looking forward to hearing later on her comments. So the session is structured as follows. I will now pass over to Vincent, who does the presentation of about 20 minutes, I think. We try to stick to time. And then we will have about 10 minutes of comments provided by Adrienne. And please feel free to put your comments, reflections, questions in the Q&A and the chat, and we are happy to pick up on those. So Vincent, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm now sharing my screen with you, which you should be able to see, and also a warm welcome from my side, of course. And thank you very much, Adrienne, for giving us the opportunity and to get your comments here. I'm now starting a timer so that we really stick to 20 minutes, because as you know, usually this doesn't end too well. And what I'm going to do in this talk, the politics of EMU, or also Economic and Monetary Union, or European Banking Union and Capital Markets Union reform, a research agenda, is I want to situate our project both within the world here at the Leibniz Institute, SAFE in Frankfurt, and within a wider research environment on Economic and Monetary Union reform in the last decade or so. What has been, yeah. So Sandra already told you there's a number of people involved in this. You will all get to know them even better during this workshop. Some of them are already here. And when we started this project, of course, we didn't plan to be in the next crisis. We started last year in April. so in the first lockdown, but the idea for this project was to take stock of the last 10 years or so of reform in the Economic and Monetary Union after the Great Recession and the Euro crisis, and to advance our understanding of EMU reform adoption and implementation. When is a reform that is proposed adopted and when not, and how does implementation differ across policy fields and within policy fields? We thought that there's a gap in the research so far in a qualitative comparative analysis of EMU reform. So we have, when we look at what is written and we look at the literature, we know there's a lot of case studies. We know there's a few comparative case studies. We also know there's a great deal of quantitative studies, but what we're kind of missing is a qualitative comparative analysis of EMU reforms that really brings us closer to these central questions: when are reforms adopted and when not. And of course, because we are here at the Leibniz Institute that is mostly about finance, economics, and so on, we wanted to bridge the gap. So this is part of our interdisciplinary outreach here, from political science, where most of our speakers today come from, political economy, and economics, finance, and finally the world of law. The agenda for today is pretty straightforward. We are going to talk a bit only about our research questions. I will give you a reform overview in 4 policy areas. This will be very narrow compared to what we did there. We published a white paper December last year, which is also available for you in our Dropbox. It's also available on the SAFE webpage. And we can talk about this a bit more in detail if you like to, but unfortunately we don't have the time because we didn't give ourselves the time to do this. And then we will give an outlook for a qualitative comparative analysis of EMU reform, what it means and what we consider useful for the future. So what is a reform anyways? We started with this question. And we said, okay, we need a time frame first, 2008 to 2020. This is pretty straightforward. It must be related to some degree to EMU, EBU, CMU. And here already, it's a bit blurry. As you know, when you come from this field, that there's a lot of differential integration going on, that there's a lot of reforms that are not in the beginning really related to either being a reform of the Eurozone or a reform of the European Union, but instead the lines between the two that are somehow important for something are not clearly drawn. And so this is always something that we need to figure out in our reform definition. And we differentiate, of course, between output and outcome. Next slide will explain you what this means. And we have limited ourselves to reforms proposed by EU institutions. In the beginning, we wanted to do a lot more, but it turns out that this is not really suitable for the kind of research project that we have here. Nonetheless, I will talk a little bit later about reform proposals, especially in the field of cooperative dissolution of the Eurozone, that do not come from official institutions for reasons that I think you all know and can understand. And maybe there are some other research opportunities that we have here, but we limit ourselves to really official reform proposals. Talking about the difference between reform overview and output, output and outcome. Output is clearly a legislative act, so either via the community method or via an intergovernmental treaty when you have a legislative outcome, output, and the outcome is then how this legislation is put into place. For example, if the law calls for an advisory or oversight committee, how is this committee put into place? What are the resources that committee has to do its task, and is this really working well? We think this is really important because often this is where the difference is when you see some policy output, when you see a successful reform on paper and then nothing happens, you start to question whether you can say this is a successful reform. We use those terms, they are fairly standard, I think, in policy and policy studies. We do not consider impact important for our studies because this would really mean in the mid and long term have these policies that we are looking at and the reforms that we're looking at helped to tackle the problem that they are dealing with. And this is, I think, a different kind of research. But also we found this quite hard sometimes to differentiate between output and outcome because we can make easy definitions here. And if you want to talk a little bit more about this and help us understand really what are the differences here, this would be really grateful. I think we also asked Adrienne to give us some impact here on the paper that she's going to comment here later, and would really like to learn a bit more about your opinion here from your field of study if this is helpful in how you would differentiate. For example, also we have the question whether we should include national implementation. We decided not to do this because this would go a little bit too far, and also it's pretty hard in the end to calibrate implementation from 27 member states to an outcome variable on a European level. However, it plays a role, so maybe there's some way around it, and we could talk about this. Then the 4 policy fields that we thought about and that we're now going to analyze are also familiar when you know the field of EMU, CBU, and banking union reform. It's first stabilizing the financial sector. This is, of course, banking union, capital markets union, system of financial supervision. Second, it's a socioeconomic governance regime that the European Union has implemented since the crisis, how it works, and here is especially the difference between output and outcome relevant. Second, third, it's a fiscal capacity. In the beginning, we thought, okay, there's not much. There's the ESM, then there's InvestEU, and then there's a proposal for Eurobonds, and Eurobonds will never happen. And then we had COVID, and all of a sudden this became much more relevant. And this allows us to evolve this much more than we thought. And now we are talking about Eurobonds here. And then the fourth one is cooperative dissolution of EMU. This is where I said in the beginning, we don't really have official proposals because obviously not. However, we included this because going back to the last decade and to really follow the kind of pathways that the European Union and the Eurozone could have taken, we think it is important to remember that this was not so off the table as some think. It was really discussed in policy field, it was discussed in the Eurogroup, and there were some times when this was semi-official. It's not important for this research project in the way that I describe it now, but it may be important to really do some research on it. And so, yeah, what we're interested in is also very briefly variation across the 4 policy areas within and between output and outcome. I've talked about it, not too much. And this is just an example what we're really looking at. So what is so to speak, our dependent variable, so to speak, because in the end, we will not talk about variables because we have a different research program, different research methodology, but those of you who are familiar with talking in variables, this helps you to understand what we're interested in. We have here, for example, the from overview and for policy areas in the area of economic governance. As I said, I will not go into detail. We have the tables for all the policy fields in the presentation. So if you have questions about this, we can go into detail later on, and I can show you the tables. What's important here, what you should keep in mind, that we are talking about, of course, successful and non-successful reform proposals. And this is a great example because we have the common consolidated corporate tax base in here, which is not only an unsuccessful reform proposal in one way, but it's an unsuccessful reform proposal in 2 ways, because it has been proposed twice by the European Commission and didn't work. And it's always good to have these non-successful reforms in to really explain what makes a successful reform. Okay, if we differentiate here between output and outcome, moving on. This has been, let me have a look at my time so far. Yeah, I have exactly 10 minutes. This is great because this was the first part. Now comes the second part. And this is, I think, really good preparation or just a lot of luck. What we want to do is a qualitative comparative analysis. Now, if you don't know anything about it, forget this term or write it down, but we don't give a methodology seminar here. If you know it, great, you are well covered, and maybe I will bore you now a bit. This means we have a set theoretical and conditional approach. It is not a linear approach, which you may know, for example, from regression analysis, where you make arguments like the more political support, the likelier a reform. Here we would say, if there is political support, then there is a reform. And if there is political support and other factors, of course, because there's no one explanation alone, then there is a reform output or outcome, or there is no reform output and outcome. And by doing this, what we can essentially do, and what we think is a really interesting thing here, what has not been done in the literature so far, is to identify relationships between sets or conditions that are pathways that lead to specific policy outputs and outcomes. And there are three important features. First, equifinality. That means a reform output that is successful can be reached on different ways. You can say we only need political support from the member states and we need a good crisis, and that's it. But you could also say, yeah, we need supranational agenda setting and no opposition, but we don't need the crisis, for example. And you can really have various ways to reach either a reform or not. We have conjunctural causation, when an effect depends on a combination of causes. So it's not that you can substitute one cause for the other, like you could do, for example, in a linear regression model, where you say, when I need a lot of support and I need a good crisis, but if I get really even more support, then I can substitute support with crisis. We cannot do this in this model. And I think this is also an advantage that we have here. And asymmetry, the same factors that explain why a reform is successfully adopted do not explain why another reform is not successfully adopted, and the other way around. So how does this look in practice? And we have talked a lot about, so now that we have this, we have our, so to speak, dependent variable. Now we need, so to speak, our independent variable or conditions in this definition. And we started to read a lot of theory and to try to make sense and to try to come up with broad terms of conditions. And here we really need your input to some degree, because we want to know if these conditions, socioeconomic situation, a crisis or not a crisis, and always think in binaries. Never at this stage start to think in degrees. Always think binaries. If there is a lot of supranational agenda setting, yes or no. If there are institutional constraints, yes or no. If there is a high influence of lobbying or interest group politics, yes or no. And if there is intergovernmental support, yes or no. The central question for us now at this stage is there anything that you think of, for example, reading literature, writing on this, having really a great knowledge of your field, that's completely missing here in terms of theoretical explanations why a political reform might be adopted or not. Now, you might also say, yeah, those are nice conditions, but this is just a textbook for, yeah, what explains what. And I will now show you how we go from having a condition that is relatively broad in an example to something that is less broad and also shows you to some degree what this can do and how this differs, for example, from variables that you put into a regression analysis. We may have the condition intergovernmental support, and this is pretty straightforward. We know this plays a role. We could now say, if this is 1, intergovernmental support is present. If this is 0, it's not present. But it may not be present for various reasons. There may be opposition. Governments may not make their position open, may not make it available. They may not care about a political reform at all. And they may be indifferent, or maybe there's a split in government. It's 50-50. But when it's 50-50, there's no support. So this goes into the 0 bracket as well. And if you had an ordinal scale, it would be in the middle. Here it is not. It's either support or not. So another condition that would do the same is intergovernmental opposition, where you could say, yeah, it's the European Union. If one member state is against it, we have opposition. And so this would turn it around. And this is exactly what I meant earlier by asymmetry. And then we think about calibrations. And I already said we could calibrate it, use it for example, decision-making structures on the Council and Eurogroup, qualitative majority votes, and anonymity. And we say whenever this is reached, then it's a support, otherwise not. We could also say, and this argument has been made a lot during the last 10 years, there's this Franco-German tandem. And when we have the theoretical expectation that this is the case, whenever France and Germany agree, then we have intergovernmental support, and then things move forward. Then we would calibrate it 1 every time France and Germany are in support of something, even though other member states are not in support. We could also say Mr. No plays a role, like Wolfgang Schäuble. Whenever he says no, then we cannot have intergovernmental support, because we say this is exactly what we know from empirical casework, this is what we know from our theoretical considerations of how the Eurozone is structured and so on. And so this means the way we calibrate things here is really crucial to the kind of results you get in the end. And then from calibration to data, and this is why this is really the last point. We talked a lot about should we present data here, and in the end we decided not to, because we think we are still more interested in calibration. Then you think about, of course, the data sets, and here we would have EMU positions. That is a really good data set by the EMU choices program. And we would update this for the years that give us preferences for governments on reforms. You could also, of course, because in the end, this is a qualitative analysis, you should really rely heavily on true qualitative data, like here newspaper articles, position papers, and so on. But you could also go with kind of qualitative data. This is often used indices and so on, where you have an ordinal scale on, for example, quality of democracy. And then you could translate this into a data for, is this democratic or not? This does not play a role here, but just to give you an idea. And looking up my time, 3 minutes, I need to hurry up a bit. So this is just how this would look like. If you have never seen this before, this is a truth table. This is just all the cases. We would have 5 conditions in this example. That means 32 cases totally. And there you could say number 7, for example, a reform is adopted when institutional constraints are high and intergovernmental support is also not high, but present. And intergovernmental support is also present. This is not a very good explanation, but we have it here because it's a possible explanation, right? And then we would see in the end which cases fit in here into our 32 cases. And this also means when you now want to discuss the conditions that we have, we cannot really just add more conditions, because for every condition, the number of theoretical cases that we may have in our sample goes up. And by now, 1.5 years after COVID started, everybody has seen a lot of exponential growth chart tables. And this is exactly what we would see here. Okay, summing up, this is just to give you another idea of how this works. This is just exemplary conditions for reform output, where we thought what might make sense without having seen it or without having tested it empirically. Just the way you have to think about it. Like if there's a crisis and mutual benefit in pooling resources and no major veto players, then a reform will be adopted. It's always like this. It's never the more, the less. Like it's not more likely that a reform is adopted. We cannot make predictions with this. It is then a reform is adopted. Also, second one is there's crisis and shared perception of how the crisis should be solved, like some kind of constructivism argument, then a reform is adopted. There's a lot of crisis here. If there is supranational agenda setting and support from lobbying groups and no politicization, then a reform will be adopted. So the key is for everything that we are doing, how are the conditions calibrated to allow us to make good arguments about this and then to test them in an empirical universe. So here, for example, we have a few possible calibrations. This is just very early work. Socioeconomic situation. When are we having a crisis in Europe? This is, by the way, one of the more interesting ones. Is it a full-out European recession? That means 2 negative growth rates for the whole of Europe. Is it a recession in 1 country? Is it a recession in 5 countries? Is it a recession in major economic areas? Or is it negative expectations? Like when are we in a crisis in Europe or not? And this is the kind of thoughts that we are having, and we'd like to have them with you. Okay, and also supranational agenda setting, like when is agenda setting present and when not, like because there will always be some background noise, and we must identify when is situations in which there are more than background noise. Okay, having said this, and I think my timer is almost up, I'd like to discuss this with you, but of course you can also always send me an email and I will discuss this with the team that we are doing this with. And thank you very much. And Adrienne, I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thanks for being able to comment this very interesting, important, and ambitious research project. I completely agree with you that an overall view of the initial, as yet to be assessed success of all these measures is missing, right, across all these fields which you are investigating. And as you say, we look at now in this first step, no evaluation of impact, but outputs and outcomes, right? And then, of course, and the question you raise, why are some implemented and why are some not implemented? So my first question, of course, was, so what's the underlying theory in proposing answers to these questions? And to some extent, you already kind of mentioning then the factors which you use multifactorial explanations into QCA, you already in a way refer to that. So, but it would be kind of nice to have this early on, you know, as a formulation of answers to your research question, which are plausible answers, why there is success or lack of success. Now, your explanandum, as you said, you focus on outputs on the one hand, outcomes on the other. And you did mention now that you sometimes you find it difficult to distinguish those two, but it's actually pretty straightforward because output is really the outcomes of the legislative decision, right? Whatever type of legislative decision it is. And the outcomes are the first measures put into place in order to implement this regulation or directive or, those two. Now, of course, when you look at a bit more closer then, your dependent variable or your explanandum, you have very different dimensions. You have the policy dimension, right, of concrete measures in the different areas, but you also have a lot of institutional structure, right, and organizations which are put into place. So that is at the moment quite crude cut, right? But there are so many subtleties in these kind of organizational forms, and also as regards to policy measures, of course. And I was wondering, when you then talked about how you do the QCA and the calibration, what about partial reforms? If you get, a small measure as compared to the original goal, how do you capture this, right? So in a way, because you do not do that in a deductive way, I thought you do that inductively from the existing literature, and you say these are the factors which are relevant, and you calibrate them. And of course, I agree with all these factors, but and that, of course, and that's how you deal then with the comparability of of those many cases you have, which are very diverse, and doing this with QCA. But one question which kind of came to my mind when I read it was, does it allow you, in order to look at also quite carefully the processes of the implementing also only to the limit, to the level of outcomes, what's actually going on? I mean, do you look at the causal mechanisms of implementing the outputs into outcomes? Because so many actors are involved in this process, right? Which you have to say happens mostly at the national level, of course. And you mentioned now that you're not planning to look at the national level, but it may be necessary that you do look at the national level. So my question was, couldn't it be that you're missing out on something if you do not look at these? I'm not calling this now process tracing, but looking at the causal mechanisms which kind of drive the production of these outcomes. Because that's our experience in our research, that if you do that, you do discover very interesting factors which you never thought of ex ante, right? And I may mention an example later on in my presentation. That was one point which I wanted to ask you. Is it, are you not kind of, you gain a lot by having this kind of systematic multifactorial analysis, combinations of factors, but does it also allow you to discover something which you haven't preconceived, right? So, and my other question is, and that regards now the extreme diversity of all the cases which you have, all these measures, being them policy measures or being them organizational measures. Because what you have now are nominal categories, right? But they are not analytical categories. So I thought, wouldn't it be possible to have within the nominal big, let's say, fiscal measures or solidarity measures or economic governance, to have also an analytical distinction of measures according to the well-known lines of distributive and redistributive, because that gives you a link to a theoretical argument, because of course redistributive measures are always very contested and lead to polarized political arenas through which then you have somehow to navigate these measures, and it will certainly make affect the outcome. And that not only as regards the benefits of political policy measures, which are obvious, of course, of all these measures you look at, but also as regards kind of redistributive impacts of institutional positions, right? Are the Commission gaining out, or are member states gaining in positional power, or are independent regulatory authorities gaining in power? That is a redistributive question as regards institutional power, which may be interesting to look at as well. Okay, these were the points I wanted to make to the overall kind of design. Now, you did write to me in an email that you would like to hear a little bit more about Commission guidelines on secondary legislation. So if you want to, I can do that briefly. I don't know what I'm doing time-wise now. Because obviously it plays a role too much how much latitude those who are implementing the measures have, right? What the nature of these Commission guidelines, right? But I can just write it to you out in an email as well.
Yeah, maybe we do this. Yeah, I had this question regarding output and outcome too. Thank you. But do you have anything else? I don't want to cut you out.
No, I wanted to end with these 4 points regarding Commission guidelines.
Okay. Yeah, if you want to send them to me in an email, maybe then we do this. Okay.
Yeah, because it's rather specific.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot to Adrienne, but also to the discussants in the chat. Oh, Adrienne, you see, Amy's. So there is interest in your points. So maybe we can share them with a workshop some way or the other. And if you send them to Vincent, maybe we can share them with a workshop. But I would like to reply to some of your points, but also with some of the points raised in the chat already, which I find extremely useful. I will leave the more, let's say, methodological issues to Vincent and in principle to Claudius Wagemann, who unfortunately still has to teach, but he is our, let's say, our boss in terms of how exactly we do the QCA analysis. But I think Vincent can maybe respond to some issues. Let me start with your last point, Adrienne, with the policy types. That is indeed a very interesting point. And when we have written our first paper, you can find it very, very prominent in the conclusions. And indeed, it is a point that does not fit to the other 5 points that we have identified, and that so far we tend to focus on our analysis. Now the problem is that we have to limit the number of conditions that we can use in the analysis more or less to 5. But I really think that the point you raised about the policy types is something that cannot be subsumed under the other points, and also is extremely important. So I think our team has to think about it and maybe, well, either drop one of the others or maybe work with 6 ones. Other points that have been raised in the chat, I think I can allocate a bit. Now, with your point on, let's say, causal mechanisms, process tracing, national level studies, I would completely agree with you. And maybe I should clarify, let's say, the purpose of this research, because what we have done before starting the project was a very broad, or we're still doing this, a very broad literature survey on the types of research that has taken place on EMU reforms. And I mean, there are more than 10 years of excellent research in the field. And I think much of this excellent research does exactly what you suggested, is way more fine-grained. We thought that, let's say, the research gap for us, but also the research gap that is interesting to our colleagues in economics, finance, and law, is really to complement this research with some kind of a bird's eye view, which would take some very broad factors across many issue areas to highlight some very simple factors that we can also communicate to policymakers, which is a task of SAFE as well. That's why we went for this bird's eye view, and we are building the factors that we have identified on a close reading of the existing literature. So you are completely right with asking, what is the theory behind these explanations? What is the theory behind these factors? This is part of a paper that unfortunately we haven't been able to finish before the discussion today in time, but where we have done a survey of dozens of studies that have looked into the reasons for adoption, non-adoption of EMU reforms. We have sorted these studies according to the basic theories behind them, from integration theories, different types of institutionalism, and so on. And we completely agree with you that it is necessary to link these factors that in our presentation now drop from the air with the theory. So thanks a lot. I mean, this is exactly the kind of encouragement that we need. But I think the point with the policy types really is a hard nut for us to crack, whether we can possibly integrate a sixth broad factor. Let me then also briefly come, because I mean, I'm only one in this group. Maybe the others want to step in as well, with some of the points that have been raised in the chat in particular by Amy, Lucia, and Elsa. Now, let me start with the first point by Amy, what is the issue about democracy, legitimacy, role of public debate, politicization. I think that is a very, very important point as well. Before discussing this in the group, I would answer it in the following. We would consider, let's say, the broad issue of democracy as something that's constant in this period of time, that we do not have as a major intervening factor. And I would tend to sort the issue of public debate, politicization, as let's say a sub-factor of the member states, so as a part of intergovernmental issues, because it comes in. I mean, these very heavy degrees of politicization are mainly in the member states. We are lacking, let's say, a very important European public sphere. At least I would dare to say. And I think if there is a very heavy degree of politicization, as we have seen in some parts of the Eurozone crisis, this comes in via the governments and via a government veto. But maybe we can disagree on this. This also relates to Elsa's question: how does public opinion come in? So far, only via this let's say intergovernmental factor, but maybe it's not enough, because only one of our 5 factors really relates to the member states, and I think that maybe we have a bias there. And then finally to Lucia's question about the financial market pressure. Well, it depends on what exactly you mean with financial market pressure. There are 2 options. One is, let's say, it's a crisis, as you have indicated. So this is something, the spreads are exploding and so on. That would be part of the crisis idea. Or this comes via intense financial sector lobbying. Then it would be part of the lobbying factor that we are trying to factor in. So that would be my answer to your question. But actually, I have to admit, these kind of ideas, suggestions, and so on, that is exactly we had hoped for that we would get from you. And at least I'm very happy with these responses. And I move on, and I think maybe Vincent wants to complement this with regard to QCA, for example?
Yeah, I can move to the QCA questions in a minute. Thank you very much, Adrienne, for your comments, and thank you also for what you put in the chat. I'm just going through it right now, and I hope that I can answer a few questions in addition to what Andreas said. For example, social movements, I read this question and then I started to wonder, and maybe it's a bit provocative, but which reform in the field of economic and monetary union, banking union, and capital markets union in the last 10 years, where do you think, which reform, where are social movements involved? Or where do you think that social movements were a driving factor in bringing us this reform? I don't know the field maybe well enough because I don't know any social movements here that really moved the Commission or the member states to bring reform, to bring a reform proposal. So that's my perspective, but it's not that relevant for really what we are looking at, but it may be more relevant for long-term developments. This is the same about the role of ideas, and the role of ideas. Unfortunately, ideas are always hard to calibrate. This is true for every research design. So you often end up not calibrating them, and this is of course a bit sloppy. But I'm completely open for getting this. And this also. I think there was public support and politicization has been mentioned. I think you could also add salience here. Yes, maybe we need a salience condition, for example. This could be helpful. Andreas has said this plays out in the member states. Maybe this plays out across the European Union, and then we would need something like a salience indicator that would need fit in somewhere. There was a question. There was a question about, I think, redistributive and distributive politics and so on. I think this, if I understand it correctly, maybe one of the results that we're getting. I mean, there's always this thought that redistributive regulatory policies are different, and we would then kind of see this in the end if they are different, if they have different reform pathways or not. Okay, then there was a question by, I think, Jonathan, why are we not doing fuzzy set QCA? We will. I just presented it in a very crisp way because it makes a lot of sense to think about it like this in the first place. Because otherwise, you tend to think about degrees, and differences in kind are more important. Like it's more important just to say whether we are in a crisis or not than to say the crisis has really hit us hard or not so hard. But of course, in the end, we need to think about this in a fuzzy set logic. Okay, I think this is what Andreas said, or what I think I should answer, or is there anything that I'm missing right now? I mean, you could also try to get in. There's a question that I will read now, but yeah, maybe Sandra wants to say something, and I think you can also now try to jump in.
Yeah, thank you, all of you. I mean, the first thing I would like to say is that we are already in the break officially now. It's 1:45. So I think many challenges that we face, I think in particular, how we do this. Is it really deductive or inductive? Is it analytical or theory driven? And that also comes up with the whole shopping list of factors, possible factors that are, of course, to some extent theory driven. It's really something we need to deal with and discuss in the group. So I think we've now really gathered very valuable input. And I also am very curious to hear Adrienne's point to differentiate further Commission guidelines and legislation, which then comes back to our differentiation of output versus outcome. So I think we have a few things still to do, but I would suggest we conclude here and maybe also exchange bilaterally in the group of the workshop participants and go and have our break before we move to the next session, if that is fine. Thank you.
I think Adrienne still wants to speak, if I interpret this correctly, right? She has raised her hand.
Just very briefly, I just wanted to add, can you hear me?
Yeah,
can
fine.
you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, when we talk about types of policies, analytical distinctions, this is very easy to deal with in the factors which you already have, because they are reflected in actors' preferences, right? If you are the one who's losing out in a redistributive measure, you are opposed to a measure, you're opposed to particular institutional setup. So it can be inserted in the definition of actors' preferences, right? Not an additional factor. That's it.
Yeah, thank you, Adrienne. I think there was a question in the chat about the length of the break. I think we have 15 minutes. Amy is correct, and we would reconvene at 2 o'clock if that is fine. I did not want to say we have half an hour, so I'm sorry for that. So if we could convene briefly after 2 o'clock, and yeah, grab a coffee and see you soon for the panel on Capital Markets Union.